Turns out he's a major cinephile. They don't watch enough movies! It's a very simple formula! And here we go. Nick Nack Goes to the Movies. You already know what it is. The second consecutive Marvel deep dive is upon us. This time talking all things Phase 2. You gotta get ready, after all, for the early July, latest and hopefully greatest MCU feature film released in The Black Widow starring Scarlett Johansson. To give you a refresher, Phase 2 expanded on the stories of 3 of our main lead actors and started to do a bit of exploring and further character introductions. This phase started to further expand that Avengers family and also to help explore a bit more with first looks at a fair amount of the Infinity Stones, albeit sometimes in strange liquid form, among other things. This phase gave us the musical stylings of the Guardians of the Galaxy, or as my dad says, that dancing tree. He's a big fan of movies and talking trees since he first saw the Ents and all that. We also had our first look at the ageless wonder Paul Rudd in a superhero role. While not the most consistent phase for the MCU, there are some high highs here, with one of the most easily top 5 of all time Marvel Cinematic Universe films in this set of 6. To figure out which one it is, time to suit up and assemble for the latest Avengers and Beyond podcast. Also a little forewarning, we'll be talking some Phase 3 MCU things. While it has been a while since those came out, some spoilers for Infinity War and Endgame. To kick this off, Iron Man 2013 started Phase 2 off, and it had a lot to live up to following the massive team-up movie in Avengers. Cast is pretty much the Iron Man team you would come to expect at this point, even though you would assume some more Avengers team-up moments after their teamwork in the previous film would happen. Not really in the cards. You would think if there was any big issues at this point in the MCU, any of these other teammates, especially the flying ones, would come help. Just wanted to throw that out there. The big adds are Guy Pearce and Ben Kingsley. It is in these 2 character roles that lead to the Marvel movie in question being mad divisive, with all the marketing materials around this movie featuring the Mandarin, a character that we will finally get to see in Shang-Chi this year, and the Ten Rings group, who had been a staple of Iron Man since the beginning in 2008, people could not help but be a bit disappointed in the trilogy of solo Iron Man movies, how it wrapped up with just this incomplete and unfulfilling story arc. Thankfully, Robert Downey Jr. went on to be a major player in all of the Avengers movies, including Civil War, which was pretty much Avengers 2.5, and of course his presence is clearly felt in the Spider-Man movies. Ben Kingsley is for sure a name brand actor that plays the most surprising role / fake out you could ever have expected. I will always think of Guy Pearce from the amazing 1997 film LA Confidential, pitting him with eventual MCU actor Russell Crowe, who we can all pretty much assume will debut and die in Thor Love and Thunder in 2022. So I don't know how many times I've seen Iron Man 3 specifically, but rarely have I gone through this many Marvel movies in back-to-back succession. This is my first time, not good, noticing Jensen from the first Iron Man movie in the flashback party. Nice connective tissue there, Marvel. And overall, it is fun seeing vintage Tony Stark again for a brief moment pre-Iron Man. Maybe not intentional, but they 100%, as far as I'm concerned, knew what they were doing, making Jon Favreau look like Vince Vega from Pulp Fiction. This is also, and I'm sure I said it on the Freeform 25 Days of Christmas episode, Iron Man 3 is one of the few superhero Christmas movies I can think of that might even be in existence. Like my scary movies, I like to have the ability to watch the superhero movies that have ties to seasons and specifically holidays. Allegedly, the latest Spider-Man will have a New York winter setting, which I'm all about. But until that comes, Iron Man 3 stands alone for winter superhero movies. Much like how Die Hard and the early Harry Potter movies can feel like holiday movies that belong on Freeform's 25 Days of Christmas. Like any good holiday movie, there has to be a really good song, musical number, something like that. And I feel like I will always have Shazam ready. I should stop at this point, but it's a bad habit. And whenever I watch this movie, I get nervous that I forgot to add Joe Williams' Jingle Bells Bombay Dub Orchestra remix version to my holiday playlist on Spotify. It is a banger of a track. Spotify, another place to listen to this podcast beside Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and Pandora, to name a few. If you have friends who are all about movies, TV, and other pop culture things, make sure to recommend them Nick Nat Goes to the Movies. It is clear walking around weather, and what better thing to listen to when you're outside or at the gym getting that good workout in than the premier pop culture podcast. Ad over. So back to the movie at hand. The start of the terrorist villain and the Ten Rings organization, honestly, it was mad exciting. It seemed darker and different, and adding someone that wasn't as physical a threat like another big robot was something that just felt like it was going to break the mold a bit. At least a good chunk of this movie, you still think that's the case. And while my opinion of this movie overall, it's a bit mixed, the one thing they really did well is make one of our heroes vulnerable. Not losing magic powers or suits for a hot second, but having long-lasting effects of anxiety for our main charismatic lead. These are just exciting ideas that we don't often see in our superhero representations. I feel like even when I first saw this movie, you never really trusted Guy Pearce's Aldrich Killian. Like, obviously most movies, TV shows don't bring in a rival tech guy who turns out to be good. Arrow kinda did it with Brandon Routh's Ray Palmer. He seemed a little more menacing to start, but clearly that's not the case at all, especially after a stint on Legends of Tomorrow. While we barely get good time with Favreau's character this time around, his badge obsession and just his whole mannerism this time around they went a little more all out with kind of a fun, quirky policing of office employees mantra. It does take this movie a bit to get going, but the whole revenge against the Mandarin and detective work feels a bit Batman, and the best parts of Batman, his detective tech and examining the digital crime scene, is once again the coolest special effects this movie has. The suit-up scenes are pretty high on this list too, of course. But there are parts of this movie I don't mind. The first big action sequence with Iron Man, taking out a bunch of terrorists at his California, I want to say house, but it's clearly more than that. This scene looks awesome and kind of makes sense. But you think one of his Avenger buddies or S.H.I.E.L.D. would help in some way. Sure, Thor would be busy at this time, saving the realms, which is seen in Thor Dark World. But S.H.I.E.L.D., you think, could have sent someone to help through all this. More dire than Iron Man 2's conflict, even though some of that was saving Tony's life. And on top of this, his house party protocol, which we see later in the movie, clearly existed before this movie started. His army of Iron Men clearly could have taken out 3 helicopters, no sweat. And he could have done that suit jumping thing he did in the final act battle. It all looks cool still, but this early conflict could have easily been solved. They just couldn't for movie plot and pacing purposes. So this movie gives Tony a pseudo-child for a bit, played by Ty Simpkins, who was also the kid in Jurassic World and The Nice Guys. His character is the best of these 3 here. I did not enjoy his Jurassic World character at all. And he does come back as an older version for the funeral scene in Endgame. And while it's nice seeing him and the kid help each other out, with what we know now, there's no comparison to his sidekick's spiritual successor, which has to be considered Tom Holland's Spider-Man. They never would have known that at the time. We were still a year away from the abysmal Amazing Spider-Man 2, the not-so-amazing Spider-Man sequel, and the MCU had no idea they'd be getting Spider-Man rights anytime soon. Time is a funny thing. His kid sidekick just doesn't do anything after Tom Holland took the role and ran with it. It also clearly makes any continuation of this character feel a bit unnecessary, but you know they're going to try and Iron Man him somehow, especially with including him at the Tony funeral in Endgame. Maybe that's another Armor Wars in the Don Cheadle show with Justin Hammer's character, TBD. Some of this movie's issues just are about the loose connections to the MCU, or just how it doesn't nearly fit as much. One Super Avengers connection is the music this time around. Gone are the rock anthems, instead with a more orchestral soundtrack. And honestly, the Brian Tyler music feels derivative of the Avengers theme, which is honestly a really good thing for me. Also, Tony Stark's character, super movie nerd, which we can appreciate on this movie podcast. The amount of pop culture references like Point Break, and in this movie calling a guy Westworld, which you would only get if you looked past the HBO TV show way into the past for the original movie in 1973. Also, I'm a movie TV guy, no doubt. May not be as much of a comic book person. Pretty much it's just The Walking Dead. Eventually I'll have to finish the Revolution wrap-up story comic one of these days. But the amount of references they have to Marvel lore in the whole MCU, not just this movie, to the Roxxon Corporation. It's in the Iron Man movies. You never see it. Briefly, it's in Marvel shows like Hellstrom, Cloak and Dagger, Agent Carter, and more. It always just feels like a wasted opportunity. And we might get some Roxxon hints in that MODOK animated Hulu show, kind of the adult animation stylings, that will be available either the day this episode comes out or the day before, pending on how edit savvy I get in a very short amount of time. Wow, the Trevor reveal to the fake Mandarin, it is something. It is not bad, but it also isn't like some great thing either. But to get to that scene, Tony's storming the proverbial castle with his makeshift arsenal. That scene is awesome, and sometimes the more Iron Man version of Tony is a little more aggressive and violent. Not in a way that's like put offish, but it just you're like, oh wow, he's actually killing some folks here and there. You really can't watch this movie and not think about that upcoming Shang-Chi movie. Between the mention of the Mandarin and the implications this movie made that clearly don't exist in the reality of that world. I need these answers and some connection between the Ten Rings organization in that movie and what we know from the Iron Man franchise, be it Trevor's punishment or some Iron Man mention, especially because at the end of that Marvel one-shot, All Hail the King, that is Trevor's eventual fate, being abducted by the Ten Rings organization. So the hope is that's not just a one-off and there'll be some mention of that. I think we mentioned this in the Phase 1 episode. Pretty much the character that kills the most people is Iron Man. And like I said, this movie is no exception to adding to his body count. It's not a small amount. There's a surprising amount of people killed. And not necessarily by Iron Man, they're killed by Tony himself. So people are like, oh, John Walker and the gun. But Iron Man, the person behind the suit, surprising amount of fatalities are of his cause. So it takes a while to get to Iron Man suited Tony. When we finally do get that final battle, him in armor and all that, it's super cool. All of his suits flying around. Even though this could have been done before, a ton of the fun varied looks of the different versions of the different marks all flying around for a big armor war. Don Cheadle gets way more action this movie, in this scene specifically. But it will always come down, this movie, to the awkward villain problem. A fire-breathing business guy who is not the real Mandarin either. You almost wish they would have just made him a villain without any Mandarin ties. While Gwyneth Paltrow doesn't always have a ton to do in these movies, the notion that she stops a villain in every single Iron Man movie, pretty interesting if you think about it. And the end is nice. This movie took an interesting version of Tony doing a lot of narrating of his own story. And it has him healing himself, and it almost is all super happy for every character involved. I will never understand the end of this, why he gets rid of all the Iron Man suits, especially when he clearly uses them for many, many films to come, including in this phase. While Iron Man 3 was hit or miss, this other 2013 MCU movie, clearly a miss. I remember getting into the full MCU around the start of Phase 2 and renting this on Redbox with the rents. It was kind of a consensus. Something was just off about Thor Dark World. While I know this may be the worst the MCU has to offer, we will find that out in the MCU complete list after the Black Widow. But let's try to understand together what went wrong here. Nothing cast-wise really has changed. The two Dark Elf main villains will for sure not be memorable at any point in this movie, and the new science guy is equally uninteresting. Zachary Levi takes over the role of Frandl from Josh Dallas, and the first watch through, you may not even be able to tell the difference. I mean, I've seen the whole Thor trilogy. I do feel like I enjoyed Josh Dallas a bit more, and it doesn't even matter because Zachary Levi has carved out an amazing role in the DCEU with Shazam, and that franchise is one of the brightest spots that DCEU has to offer right now, and we can't wait to see what that sequel will bring. Renee Russo, the wife of Odin, gets way more time to do things, and her fight scene and death at the end of this is easily one of the best parts with emotional resonance in the whole movie. And just a fan of Chris O'Dowd from the IT Crowd to his present role in the TV adaptation of Get Shorty, his brief role as a love interest to Portman, while brief, for sure, it's one of those same few things I just like here. Way more than I need to. So, like the first movie, we get a little flashback battle. There's more laser guns and spaceships here, which ruined the high fantasy a bit for me. And the fighting is good and all, but in short, at best, I just marginally care about this. Especially since the first movie just did it better. And it doesn't help that the main bad guys have this mask that isn't hard or scary. It just feels goofy for that big bad army. I will say the youngness in Thor's face and voice from the previous two movies, it's a bit more what we've come to expect from him with the rest of his MCU time. And this is early in the episode about this movie. I'm not saying where this movie went wrong was exactly here, but this movie making Stellan Skarsgård run around speaking about wild science fiction things naked and playing that joke twice, it feels like one of those jokes I just never found funny. And it feels like, once again, they had no idea what to do with any non-Thor character in this franchise. It also took them a while to tell the audience how Thor was able to get back to Earth in the Avengers. And it seemed so unfixable at the end of the first Thor, but apparently it wasn't all that hard to fix the Bifrost Rainbow Bridge at all, was it? The biggest question we all wonder is how is it so easy for random humans to accidentally fall into this Infinity Stone amorphous blob in the ether, which is the reality Infinity Stone if you want to keep track. Kind of like the humans in the Snyder Cut just casually tossing the mother box and burying it into the ground. Although, that was the last one anyone found, so they must have done something right hiding it in the open. Even though the composer is for sure different from Thor 1 to Thor 2. Brian Tyler also builds into that epic soundtrack, which really sets the tone for the fantasy superhero genre. And I know we just talked about the doubling of story beats with the scientist Eric Selvig's character. It's not even the only time they do it, and it's a mad annoying thing that they keep doing in this movie. We saw the battle first, then we see this animated book reading about it again, and it's all within the first 30 minutes or so. And this isn't a 2-hour or 3-hour movie. This is like on the 1:30 range, thankfully. That being said, I do love that we get more Asgard and less Earth this time around. It's a fun setting that was a bit sidelined the first time around, spending so much time with our main character Thor in Earth. This movie does also take ages to get us some quality Loki time, and fans of the franchise should know, the more Tom Hiddleston, the better. His absence is clearly felt in that first third or so of this movie. Also, while Idris Elba is awesome in most things, that Ghost Rider sequel, his superhero career was not good in that at all. It's pretty cool watching him take down a big spaceship here. Like, he can see it and no one else can when they're cloaked. This franchise always gives him like a few cool moments or so, but this movie really had no idea what to do with him after that moment. And while I like spaceship battles, Star Wars, Guardians of the Galaxy, the science angle here made Star Wars things a part of Thor. And it just always felt off. Thankfully, Ragnarok makes this balance work much better, partly taking it out of Asgard, where science and spaceships make some more sense out of this place that, in theory, is supposed to have flying horses and rainbow bridges and things like that. The highlight moment of this movie has to come when Frigga, who once again gets some action here, finally, almost single-handedly defeats the villain until she unfortunately dies. The scene following this leads to the single-handed worst logic jump in a movie I have seen. Hear me out. In Thor Dark World, there's literal proof before the big Asgard invasion battle that you can attack and destroy cloak ships. Idris Elba does that right before the showdown starts. When Thor's mom, coming off her best franchise fight moment, dies, he starts putting the hammer down and avenging. Classic Marvel stuff. But somehow, when he throws his hammer at it, it just loses its tracking power when the thing decides to cloak, which seemingly, as long as the hammer kept moving forward, it would have destroyed the ship and saved the day. No sense. And it's crazy. And the funeral scene after that is beautifully shot, and the soundtrack for that moment is awesome. And that's the inherent issue, besides repeating story beats multiple times in a short window. This movie has moments of amazingness, but it's normally wedged between two moments of just garbage. And it takes about halfway through the movie to even get Thor and Loki together again. And I do love there's a brief moment we get of him hiding his grief with his magic illusion powers. Bring on that trauma and grief and depression, Marvel. I eat all that up. Nom, 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 you know. While we know Tom Hiddleston is a gift to Marvel and the MCU, really hope that Loki show does something for me. But while he and Thor are walking and he is figuring out how to disguise himself, for a brief moment we have Chris Evans in full star-spangled outfit, acting as Loki in jest. And honestly, this scene gave me so much hope, and it reminded me how much I wanted that Captain America sequel. It also reminded me how much I enjoyed that fight scene in the first Avengers movie with them interacting one-on-one. This movie also continues a trend that starts in Iron Man 3, in MCU characters losing arms, some robotic, some fake-outs, ton of arm losses in the MCU from this point on. A few eye losses are among, the road to it, but they lose hands and arms like a Resident Evil recent game or Star Wars movie. So in this scene, there's some good Loki trickery, there's some fake outs, the fighting looks really good. Pretty much after this moment of them breaking Loki out, it's about to stop caring immediately after this. We get some okay enough fights on the Dark Elf planet, and while this may not be the most exciting thing the MCU has given us, the fight is what you've come to expect from superhero things, and a Loki sacrifice, which we love, especially with what happens in the next Thor movie and the end of this one. But the movie immediately stops mattering here, with a chaotic final third, fourth, whatever you want to classify it, that has a doofy final fight, throwing things, these long metal rods at the Dark Elf boss, making certain body parts disappear at random times till there are no more parts and a ship crashes him. Even though there are some fun larger Thor world ties with some Jotunheim ice big lizards, overall this movie ends in generic and, dare I say, bad vintage superhero content. Thankfully, the next movie in Phase 2 really steps up and shoulders the weight from here. Possibly one of the greatest Marvel movies of all time, and for sure in Phase 1 and 2. Captain America: The Winter Soldier, coming out in 2014, is everything a sequel should be. Now, I know we aren't able to get the same cast from the first one, on account of most of these characters being dead with the time jump, but as much as I loved the period piece, this movie adds some amazing new cast members, some from short or long roles in the MCU to come. Samuel L. Jackson, Scarlett Johansson, and Kobe Smulders are all back in the S.H.I.E.L.D.-heavy movie that feels more in tune with the larger MCU than the previous two Phase 2 solo sequels. This movie also gives us the amazingness of Anthony Mackie in the role that we would get the equivalent of a first solo movie in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Speaking of the Winter Soldier, the big fun, of course, was Sebastian Stan making his return to the world as a hidden assassin, giving Steve a true villain version of himself and a moral dilemma. A few older versions of characters are back too, including Haley Atwell and Toby Jones from the first Cat movie. Masterclass actor Robert Redford is introduced into the MCU, and that provides some gravitas and name recognition to this Marvel world. And it helps that reputation of superhero movies once again having that respectability. Lastly, as a Prison Break guy and a Purge movie fan, can't wait for the new one, which may be my first in-person theater viewing movie since Birds of Prey. Brock Rumlow is great here as an initial ally until the eventual change of pace twist. the first interaction and joke of On Your Left, which we eventually see payoff for the rest of the MCU, seemingly. Like, that immediate chemistry of Chris Evans and Anthony Mackie is fun, and just the casting in this movie is once again perfect, adding new powerful bonds and relationships, be they short or long term. They're building on these things, and some of it could be past MCU characters or things that are still being felt in the modern MCU storylines. Overall, it may not be the most explosive intro action set piece, but the Modern Warfare 4 style stealth rescue ops mission on a boat with a ton of shield elements and a strong fight moment with Georgia St. Pierre's Batroc. The beginning is a lot of fun, and while we are finally getting our solo Black Widow movie, this movie does give Scarlett Johansson a ton of screen time to shine. Not unlike Iron Man 2, but more and better. I feel like this movie is exactly what I had hoped for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to be. While it was that up until Season 2, it veered hard left after that and the eventual surprise to end this movie. Also, with Captain Marvel, that trusting someone and losing an eye line, it just feels a bit goofy realizing he's talking about an alien cat now. This movie ties into the amazing nostalgia of the first Avenger movie, an unwavering look at government corruption, and his character will always be this duality of optimism and true justice, paired with an overbearing cloud of sadness and cynicism for the way the world is. I love this complexity. I know, Samuel L. Jackson's Nick Fury will never be the star of the MCU. The Secret Invasion show will hopefully give us his time to shine. But that car scene and him evading and firefighting his way out through a ton of fake officers before seemingly dying, those are some amazing car chase action scenes that put the Fast and Furious series to shame. The spy government conspiracy world fits in super well with Captain America, and this subgenre works the best of all of Marvel's ideas to branch out at this point, being a twofold superhero movie that has elements of Shooter, V for Vendetta, and more. I'm sure I've talked about Emily Van Camp, Revenge, and more in the Falcon and the Winter Soldier episode recap, but coming from her role of unassuming to being related to the OG Agent Carter to Grand Villain, I don't love that shift, but I love her small but important role in this movie. It gives a face to the more generic every man, every woman people existing in the S.H.I.E.L.D. world. That's not just Nick Fury and such. Pretty much, if you like this movie and you like the MCU, you're all about Samuel L. Jackson and Nick Fury. And you know anyone saying anything bad about him is laughable, trying to claim he's a bad guy. It makes it clear that whoever's saying that is probably bad. Even if it is admittably in a subtle way, Robert Redford. There are many notable scenes in this movie, but no matter what, the close quarter elevator fight scene, the one where we clearly can tell something is off at S.H.I.E.L.D., it's the best frantic fight choreography in such a small place that I've seen, probably ever, and it really ramps up this movie crazy high on my Letterboxd rating alone. The big twist here, of course, is this secret all-good government body S.H.I.E.L.D. has Hydra growing in it throughout history. Not so much the hardcore Nazi things, just evil government things. Just that, I guess. That's not bad enough. But that twist was so good. And figuring out which S.H.I.E.L.D. people were good and which were Hydra, so many amazing questions and thoughts this provided the viewer. And of course, that twist also gave us the best of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the TV series. As we talked about, this movie has ties to the whole MCU, with exposing previous people as Hydra agents. This whole franchise darling also finds a way to get away with throwing one of these people from the moving vehicle to getting hit by another moving truck, which once again, Marvel movies are never going to be the violentest of movies. That's pretty good though for a not showing any blood thing. This, of course, leads to, once again, one of the better action set-piece moments with cars, guns, and tons of fisticuffs. Something that is always going to top fighting big, amorphous blob CGI monsters. Also, it should go without saying, but I'm all about the reemergence of the World War II Captain America outfit. While I lament the end of S.H.I.E.L.D. as a main function after this story, The fact that the conflict involves so many people and not just two super people battling, it all just feels and looks as grounded as can be when it comes to a movie that has a flying metal winged man. And overall, that flying metal winged man, Anthony Mackie, is a great addition to Team Cap and the MCU. And the entire group, the Star-Spangled Man, Black Widow included, they all get their time to shine, action-wise, in this last third. Sure, the end of this movie has a fight on a big flying ship against the Winter Soldier. It's a bit similar to the last battle in the first Cap movie, but gosh, it's so cool to watch stylish fisticuffs on big, sinking planes. It worked in Air Force One, and it still works here. But beautiful, sensational movie. This was the Phase 2 win Marvel needed post-Avengers. Also, I mentioned it once before, but clear missed opportunity to have Hawkeye hunting down Cap in a deleted scene that I don't think was ever filmed. For shame. So, Guardians of the Galaxy in 2014, easily the biggest Marvel risk at the time. No clear tie to the Avengers, not an immediate name brand mainstream recognition for more casual superhero fans. Look, Space Wars, it's all the rage. Star Wars, and I guess some people like Trek too. Pretty unfamiliar except for the newish movies. But as far as subgenres go, this is a pretty safe genre. And the hope was people will come for the track record of Marvel's success. In the core 5 actors, Chris Pratt, Vin Diesel, Bradley Cooper, Zoe Saldana, and Dave Bautista. Today that feels like an all-star lineup, even if 2 of the 5 are just voice actors. You also have some buried, well enough known names in John C. Reilly, who is and forever will be the guy in the Will Ferrell movies, Benicio del Toro, and Glenn Close. Also, Walking Dead fan Nick is a huge fan of anything Michael Rooker, with his brief Walking Dead stint only able to hold me over for so much. So for starters, this movie is soundtracked beautifully. It's a fun change of pace, and I love me some soundtrack orchestral music, which is in here, but the movie plot and character moments tie in so well with the character himself having these 70s, 80s, oldies songs. It just adds to this movie overall, having this source of music that exists not only for us, the viewer, but for the character himself and having an important part in the plot. And while this franchise will always be known for its over-the-top and goofy nature, the beginning of this movie is an emotional masterclass of a kid remembering his dying mom through her music, not able to cope with her dying in front of him, and eventually, early on, living with that guilt of not being able to hold her hand in that final moment. Overall, this franchise does have some more somber moments for the bright and sparkly superhero genre. That being said, if you're looking for a straight-shot, cookie-cutter sci-fi movie, this ain't it. Pretty quickly, our hero in this eventual ensemble piece is bopping around and dancing to the second best song in the movie, Come and Get Your Love by Redbone. The oldies music counterpoint struck a good nerve with audiences early on. This song is also the theme song for F is for Family, another adult animated show on Netflix, which, while fine, is sometimes even too depressing, even for me, the king of depression. There is always a fine line between arrogance and charming confidence, and Chris Pratt as Peter Quill never comes off as too annoying. He's just fun, which is as good of an incredibly brief summation of the overall movie and franchise. Just fun. If there's one huge issue with this movie, it's the same issue we had with Thor Dark World. The main villain here, Ronan, is just a generic menacing bad guy. The amount of colorful characters in this movie is vast, but if your main villain is the most boring character of the bunch, huge issue. Also, our first main group interaction with Rocket, Groot, Gamora, for a group of unknown characters overall, it's pretty easy to get behind this group of fun, be they breaking out of prison, finding one another, or doing whatever, seemingly. Also, the best song in this movie, Hooked on a Feeling by Blue Suede. The song that captured audiences to get this song downloaded ASAP and flock to the theaters, when that was a thing. This song alone helps this movie get a high Letterboxd rating from yours truly. If you don't know what that is, as I've talked about it a few episodes and a few times in this episode, it is the premier social network site for movie reviews. I am on it. You can rank movies, rate reviews, see what other friends on Facebook and Twitter are ranking and reviewing movies. It is a fun social element to movie viewing, especially in this time when a lot of us are viewing movies by ourselves. I'm on it. You should come join me there. To the movie at hand, it takes a bit to get to the fifth member of the Guardians in Drax. And honestly, this movie has the best version of Drax compared to either later Avengers movie or Guardians 2. He's still menacing. He has some jokes, but later on movies he gets a little too jokey. And I think, unfortunately, his Thanos connections are brief at best when the movie kind of puts that character in front of it, which in this movie there's a clear issue and reason for conflict more that he has than most of our other large group of heroes. Yes, Ronan killed his family, but Thanos gave the order, so something was missed with the whole long arc story in Endgame. And look, there were so many characters and they all had a reason to not like him, so be it, but you wish there would have been something there to connect those two. But to another good Guardians thing, this movie and the sequel have a fairly praised critical representation of autism that is not throwing it in your face like a medical disease. It doesn't mock it, and instead of this nerd isolated type, he's one of the more physically imposing of the group, so it's nice to see that representation is fairly appreciated in the larger world and not just seen as a joke throughout. The most this movie ties to the overarching Marvel story, besides having Infinity Stone, is actually having Thanos in more than a post-credit scene. Not that he needs to be everywhere in this movie, because he's not, but having him have some lines and be more than a menacing figure in the shadows with a snappy one-liner. It's needed to get him integrated and up to speed in the story that would be told in the amazing 2-part Infinity War Endgame saga. Also, while I super don't care for Ronan at all, the part where he staff blows the voice of Sauron knockoff's head around 180 degrees, it always makes me laugh for some reason. I don't know, I like it. It's a good moment. And if you liked pop culture references from Iron Man as much as I do, get ready for a ton of them here. They may be a bit dated, that's part of the charm of the movie, but if you're about them, another reason to get into the Guardians franchise. It's crazy how much you care for a talking tree in this movie that has the same 3 words spoken in the same specific order until the very end. Look, I don't know if anyone can top Treebeard for talking greenery, and Grandmother Willow is pretty snappy too. But somehow, with all of this and how little Groot says, he's still the most endearing, tall talking tree that has some super sad moments. And not that the little version's not bad, it's cute and all that fun stuff, but the tall version of Groot will always be my favorite. We haven't actually talked a lot about Benicio del Toro, who did have another post-credit moment at the end of Thor Dark World. And I love his work. I love The Usual Suspects, and he's great in his eccentric, quirky, brief role. Something, however, went very wrong with his Star Wars role. But that whole movie, more so the 2 movies after The Force Awakens, got a bit lost along the way. It takes ages to get to the more fun Roker Ravager moments in this movie. Thankfully, there's more of that in Part 2, Volume 2. But this is a staple part, him and his team, of the movie and the franchise. Call me biased, but the story they eventually weave with him and Pratt. And of course, the whistle arrow stuff is super cool. But the sequel scenes are just better in both the relationship of those 2 characters and the arrow scenes. Not that they're not good here too, but the growth they have, you wonder and wish they'd had more and more of that. We do eventually get some vintage Star Wars fun with ship battles and all, which is what we're here for, no doubt. Seeing Groot fight people will never not be fun. In general, anything Groot does, fighting, interaction, it's either hilarious, beautiful, or badass. The end of this movie has a ton of different action fights happening all at once. The space battles, which have emotional moments too. In the pre-final fight, there are a ton of strong, exciting things happening. But the last one doesn't really do anything with superpowered Ronan. Nebula, who I have really not talked about a whole lot, the sister of Gamora, is interesting as a slightly less charismatic version of Loki and a recurring villain. Look, Ronan is the worst part of this movie. And right before the final fight, albeit underwhelming conflict, we have that final Groot beauty becoming a big ball and saving everyone else, sacrificing himself. It's one of the most touching moments of the whole film, and it looks beautiful. I can't express how good it is. If you haven't seen it, please see this movie, but that scene is so good. This stellar moment is unfortunately lost after a bit of a generic bad guy monologue, a whatever dance joke that no matter what, I've never found funny somehow. Even the power of friendship moment, it's a bit cheesy in the end. Obviously, this is another tease to him being more than human. But in that one moment where you take a little bit of the cheese out of it, the callback to the amazing emotional beginning of taking his hand and seeing his dead mother and reaching out to people, that hits the emotions on a whole new world and level. We need those sad, somber moments mixed in our Marvel movies. I know it's not going to be the darkest franchise ever, but when those moments are there, they are there and well done. This movie is one bad villain away from being the best of Marvel. And that end of finally opening his mom's letter and present, he took her hand finally, and this emotional resonance is what we are here for. And having a volume 2 from his music, from her, and figuring out that the Star-Lord thing was a nickname that came from her, like her conception of an idea. It's a beautiful wrap-up. The only brief mention here I want to say is having the Nova Corps and Xandar, clearly a big part of this movie. You can't help but wonder where Nova, the hero, is. The MCU allegedly will bring this in, especially with that planet destroyed off-screen. This needs to come sooner rather than later to build on that resonance, on that moment of impact of that whole world being destroyed. So now it's time for the latest big-scale Avengers movie in Age of Ultron, which came out in 2015. Or some might say, the week or two of Ultron. This movie once again brings all the characters back that you would expect for the most part. Anthony Mackie's role is quite small, and you might think the same about Don Cheadle. Thankfully, he gets an action scene. But you can't help but wonder why they couldn't have both of these characters flying side by side, taking out baddies in the end. They find a way to have a lot of flashbacks and another brief way to get Haley Atwell, Idris Elba, and Stellan Skarsgård in this already packed movie. The big ads are James Spader, who is still crushing it on the NBC show The Blacklist. Paul Bettany is now not just a voice actor, but he gets a voice and a body. They also gave us the beginning of Elizabeth Olsen and Aaron Taylor-Johnson. Two of these three characters would end up in a lovely dark sitcom in WandaVision. One of them did not. We will get into some more actor-specific stuff, especially as this movie goes on, but want to at least touch on it, with there being so many moving pieces. No matter what, that Avengers theme, any version of it, will always get you going. Just a fact. And this movie starts off with some amazing action footage. We immediately get the cool team-up freeze frame. Like the Avengers before it, there are some moments that will always feel goofy from Joss Whedon. And once again, I like this movie, but there are some missteps. The action and fighting, really good. The superpowers look really good. Some of the jokes, kinda eh. You didn't see that coming is good. Cap yelling language, not so good. And Thomas Kretschmann, Baron von Strucker, is way too good of a villain and actor to be dealt with in less than 10 minutes after being introduced. He's one of the better parts of the second Resident Evil movie, and he is just a really good villain character actor. I gotta imagine he and Mads Mikkelsen will be villains in the latest Indiana Jones movie. I will always be annoyed about that, and unlike what we got with Daniel Bruhl and Baron Zemo, his movie role was brief, but not being killed off, he was able to get a second wind in MCU TV, and of course this gave us the Zemo cut. This character, and Hydra, should have had something with a movie before Age of Ultron, a Hydra Shield War movie or show. I mean, that's what they did with the Clone Wars between Episode 2 and Episode 3. I'd still watch that. While Wanda's powers are rarely explained, there's something fun about Tony being haunted by Thanos before. We don't even see Thanos in this movie, just the idea of the destruction, the war of Avengers, and more just devastation, all that fueling his drive to create Ultron, his inevitable doom. This power seems like she would use this all the time, and it's clearly only ever used in this movie. The dialogue here is so painful. I will try not to mention all the annoying jokes. I don't know if they ever bugged me as much until you realize they're really only in a few specific Marvel movies. Sadly, those movies are two of the main Avengers team-up moments. I know I already talked about Strucker being killed off camera, waste of a thing. And it's annoying. There's a reason I want to talk about it. Helen Cho is the scientist skin person who helps make Ultron, and she's another one of the people in this movie where it's full of that they're used and just never seen again. Even after they're introduced, they're just gone in the wind. Like, the flashback fear scenes have a lot of this. Hopefully the Red Room and the traumatic past of Black Widow, including this Madam B assassin leader character, will be in her solo outing movie. And while it's brief, I gotta love it. Having Andy Serkis in this, war profiteering scene, his character is fun and engaging. We only get him in here and in Black Panther. I liked him in the role. Between those two movies, we get close enough to almost a whole movie with his fun live action. Him is great, even though he's clearly known for his CGI roles in Lord of the Rings and Planet of the Apes. Love me some live action Andy Serkis. And I don't know the limitations this movie had. And I don't know if it would have been possible, but they should have found a way to do it. Natalie Portman, barely in the MCU post-Dark World. Thankfully, we'll see her again in Thor 4. Gwyneth Paltrow is fairly integrated through the MCU as a whole, even though the time and movies she's in is a little briefer. Seeing both these characters in the party scene, even briefly like Anthony Mackie, it would have just added to the whole larger scale feel of the MCU as a whole. Missed opportunity for sure. If nothing else, the party scene has a lot of ups and downs, but the for sure up is the amazing Hammer Budge scene from Chris Evans that thankfully gets some amazing payoff in Endgame. It may be divisive. I quite like the dark version of "there ain't no strings on me." It's creepy, and it finds a way to use that Disney brand synergy in a way that makes sense. The initial cut of Avengers Age of Ultron, as you know, I'm a director's cut fanatic, was about 30 minutes longer. And you can see where the missing scenes would have fit in. We go from an Avengers Tower scene to the Maximoff twins meeting Ultron, where there's no reason for them to just randomly go to an abandoned church. A deleted scene that was filmed would have filled in that logic jump. I have the same criticisms about Batman vs. Superman. The extended cut filled in scenes that just made things make sense from a point A to point B stance. The Lord of the Rings extended cut added a ton of amazing scenes for character development. Great, amazing work. But the original made sense at least. This in Dawn of Justice needed those extra filler scenes to fully make sense. At least the Batman vs. Superman extended cut exists. This will probably never happen. There will always be something fun about the Quicksilver of the MCU and X-Men universes, played by two different kick-ass actors, one being the lead, one being Evan Peters from American Horror Story. Aaron Taylor Johnson does nothing wrong in this role. We gotta make that known. But, man, the X-Men version and how his powers look and the musical notes of "time in a bottle," it's so good. It's tough to be better than that. It's just at fault to Aaron Taylor Johnson not being as cool and fun as that. It's truly spectacular. When he was introduced in WandaVision, man, were we all excited. There is still hope that Ralph Bonner is a CI of Jimmy Woo and is a multiverse of madness version of the character, and either that film or Spider-Man 3 will give us our true Quicksilver crossover we've all been hoping for. And while I'll always be annoyed that Strucker or this first original version of Quicksilver were never in that WandaVision show, that also was the one big dig against that show. I mean, look, I could talk Quicksilver for ages. I just wanted to get that out there. But now back to non-WandaVision and non-X-Men things. We already did 3 episodes on those topics that you can check out if you want more of my take on those things. The Wakanda initial reference, like the Doctor Strange tease in Winter Soldier, just building those footprints for these later moments, years down the road. That's the brilliant setup you like to see and kind of expect at this point from Marvel. If there are 2 things you realize pretty quickly on, it's thankfully Hawkeye gets some time to shine. He's clearly not sidelined like the first movie, and something about him being the one character to not get mind control, already living that life in the first Avengers movie, it's a nice little payoff. And while Ultron may not be menacing, James Spader is a fun romp onto the character. He eats up voice acting every moment. Some of the dialogue may not always be perfect, but he makes it work almost every time. Almost. I already mentioned it, but those flashback scenes for Thor, Cap, Black Widow, all super fun, brief character development moments. And they add to those solo outings and the eventual arc we will see play out with Black Widow soon enough. You know what's annoying? You look at that group, and Iron Man had a moment, of course, in the beginning of the movie. You notice one character missing. Is it the Universal owned character? It sure is. You see everyone's fear moments, and you see this tease of Wanda wanting to go after the Hulk, and then there's a jump cut to his destruction. It will never make sense, and that issue pops up a few times here. I would have really liked to have seen some of those fears, and yeah, you could assume it's something similar enough to the Incredible Hulk movie that they, at this point on, were not even remotely wanting to mention. But especially if we weren't going to ever have a solo movie from 2008 to 2021 and beyond, the closest we'd get is that Ragnarok movie and maybe the She-Hulk show. It would have been something to see anything more with the Hulk like that. As someone who doesn't hate the farm season of The Walking Dead, the farm scene here does drag on a bit. The Hawkeye family reveal is fine, but you immediately stop caring since the next time you see them, they're just dust in Endgame. The emotion's there, but the characters seemingly don't matter. And with Hawkeye not being present at all in the Infinity Wars for some reason, this adds to that awkwardness of it. This scene does have Chris Evans tear open a little stump of wood, which objectively is amazing, and just one rung down from Chris Redfield punching boulders. This does a really good job with setup for the continued divided relationship cracking between Cap and Stark and the eventual Civil War payoff. They always seem to have this mutual respect for each other, but you never really can say, are they friends? It feels like you'd say yes, but it feels like there's always that question. Because further just splitting that comes from their relationship in this, it was existing in the first movie and it just widens here. And I love that. And you know what's nice? More Samuel L. Jackson. He makes every Marvel movie better. He may only be briefly here, but gosh, is he amazing every single time. And we cannot get that solo project movie from Disney Plus. It cannot be here soon enough. ASAP it is needed. While I wish we had more from the Thor pond scenes, especially since there was clearly more, that was one of those deleted scenes that we could have got some more exposure into his psyche and more Infinity Gauntlet visuals. The tease for that info being privy to the Avengers, the more of it, the better for that just long game setup. I always feel bad that Quicksilver never really got his time to shine. His death in this movie, and yes, they had to kill someone here, but that development that could have been and never will be. The fact that there is any version of like the suit up scene for these two Maximoff twins in a tower that they've never been in once, silly, super silly. I know one of the suit ups is literally just give me a pair of sneakers, but it always just feels goofy. And I guess there was a deleted scene of the jacket that Wanda wears, because you can't call her Scarlet Witch, was Black Widow's jacket, which would have been a fun little moment. I don't know. Deleted scenes are so frustrating when it feels like you could tell where they belong in movies and where it just makes sense to have it in. Give me the extra time. If it makes sense and works, if it's good enough, you won't notice you're there for a while. I sure won't. 4-hour Justice League Nick is all about that. So once we get past the silly suit up things, we get to the latest big city destroying battle, this time floating Sokovia, being slightly reminiscent of the world engine destruction of Man of Steel. And like that movie, this destruction leads to eventual long-standing consequences in the next follow-up. But the action spectacle clearly here. The fights and individual team moments are all amazing, and the growth we get from Wanda. Thankfully, in modern Marvel, we can finally call her Scarlet Witch. Finally. And the eventual S.H.I.E.L.D. moment, we thought, oh, maybe the Samuel L. Jackson thing was just a little quick, brief cameo, nothing more. It comes late, but having one of those helicarriers show up, it adds, it does so much to the overall Marvel fun connection that we needed. It's a nice touch to see them in full, especially since this stops being a thing soon and gets a bit more integrated into just the Avengers support staff. And yes, War Machine looks good in this team-up movie, flying around with Iron Man. Look, Falcon existing, missed opportunity here. But seeing the Iron Man War Machine, like, the fighting in Iron Man 2 was okay. It was okay. But in the sky, shooting all these flying bogeys, it's something we needed for a while now. And in all these cool action moments, bad dialogue just has to rear its ugly head in there and creep up on us. Thor, you're bothering me. That quote from Murder Robot Ultron, it's bad writing. As good as a lot of this movie is, the writing will always be a hang-up. Something you may not notice watching one of these, or only watching a Marvel movie once in a while, but marathoning through these like I did, you can tell the good and bad writing movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Of course, the big moment, or one of the two, the death of Quicksilver, that is something we did not need. Meeting him once and killing him off, not good. I know we have to kill characters, but killing them immediately, not good. But you gotta appreciate the character arc and trajectory of death and trauma it forces Wanda to deal with. If Magneto ever is in the MCU, more of when instead of an and, how they're going to handle the Maximoff children will be something. And even this early on ripping a robot heart out, and it's just a robot, it's not too crazy gory. It's a strong, darker moment. Once again, we like that. They end up sending Hulk away for ages to come. Thankfully, his Hulk and Thor movie is amazing. But it would have been nice to at least see Civil War Hulk, especially with bringing characters from that movie back into the MCU at this point. I mean, he's not a Asgardian god. He's a person, and it feels like he would have a big role to play in this conflict and can be a divisive factor in the conflict. So yeah, overall, and I know I've said a lot of criticisms, especially noticed in the full marathon, this is a good enough movie. There are obviously worse MCU movies, and this is by no means a bad movie, but there are some clear missteps in dialogue and cutscenes, and quickly getting rid of few characters. But the end post-credit Thanos fine, I'll do it myself. It's sinister and amazing, but that really feels like it would have taken place after Guardians when Ronan failed and died. It has nothing to do with Ultron failing, I think. I don't know. That always was cool at the time, but it made no sense to the actual plot. On to Ant-Man from 2015 to close out Phase 2. Before I say anything, I was pretty close to skipping this because of bugs. The big movie spider fear in me was a little bit nervous. And thankfully this movie never is so gross or scary with its bugs to be problematic or unwatchable. So good PSA to start. This movie reminds me of the Guardians of the Galaxy. The good and unfortunately the bad. But there is more good like that film. This movie introduces us to a whole new cast of characters, while also keeping some larger MCU ties. The legend that is Michael Douglas is here. Having never seen Lost, I'm only so familiar with Evangeline Lilly outside of the Ant-Man films. Apparently, The Hurt Locker is just a big MCU reunion, but she is easily a huge add to this universe, and thankfully is quickly shown just how capable she is in a fight, having to unfortunately wait for the sophomore film to actually suit up. The small group add of T.I., Michael Pena, and David Dastmalchian, who is in his third live-action superhero movie after The Dark Knight and soon to be The Suicide Squad, where he looks to have a bigger role than expected based on his character being Polka Dot Man. This lead, of course, is Paul Rudd, who is sensational in the role, like a goofier Star-Lord, and somehow more grounded and even more likable. While I like Corey Stoll in House of Cards, sadly his villain is not super up to par, but we will get to that. Probably the biggest surprises are Haley Atwell and John Slattery, with an old S.H.I.E.L.D. flashback to kick off the movie. That is an immediate pleasant surprise. And honestly, I wish we could have gotten more live action of those two as well as Dominic Cooper. This would not be the last film version of either Atwell or Slattery. And honestly, young Hank Pym as a de-aged Michael Douglas looks pretty good. It was a big risk using Scott Lang's version of the character instead of the OG Hank Pym version, but having both and one taking the mentorship role to explain why the character wasn't around in Marvel's world until now, it clearly works well. The goofy nature, it just feels right at home in Ant-Man. This is for sure in part to Pena and Rudd's comedic timing and their chemistry together. I know we just came off a brief family thing in Avengers Age of Ultron, but the family story is tied so tightly to the fibers of this movie, both the Hank Pym story and the Scott Lang story. But I actually want to focus on the Lang family story, having a family man with tough past, trying to raise a daughter and gain co-custody. He can't raise her because he can't see her yet until he has a stable job based on his criminal past is going to be a doozy. It's a grounded, amazing story with some levity, real-world issues, and it shows some amazing and interesting representation. And yes, as a Captain America fan, seeing an old-timey war footage with the OG Ant-Man, I need more of that. I wish we had more of that. I didn't mention this in the actor brief to start this episode. The Archer fan of me has to mention Judy Greer. Cheryl is one of the many highlights of that amazing adult animated comedy that has thankfully found its way back to the spy world. And young Cassie Lang is played to perfection by Abby Ryder Fortson. While I may not love the endgame and arc of another killed-off villain once he's introduced, played by Corey Stoll, his villainous nature is no more intimidating, and easily this is one of the darker or best scenes in the MCU history, using a semi-working shrink ray to transform a naysayer of his work into a small pile of human waste and casually wiping it off with a paper towel and flushing it down a toilet. That scene will never not be amazing. Besides being another risk of different unknown MCU characters, even with the MCU ties, the genre attempt of a superhero heist movie, it pairs way better than you would think, in part to the casting and in part to the directing and writing. Peyton Reed and the amazing Edgar Wright really did something special with this. The best part of this movie, as far as random comedy and storytelling goes, the long trajectory storytelling of a ton of actors mouthing words in classic Pena way, and all in his voice. Like, the jump cuts are stylistically shot and told, and the music on top of it feels like a parody of heist movies in itself. The actual heist scene, the first one we get, it looks the part. And it's less, as Rick and Morty would say, terrible heist culture of explaining away things that already happen. It just seems like MacGyvering things to make the heist. And it all looks super cool. And I'm not just jaded to the industry. I love the Italian Job after all. Look, shrinking movies exist all over the place. Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. I'm sure there's others. That's the only one I can think of with Rick Moranis. Like time travel movies, which are also a dime a dozen. Our first introduction to this power is both terrifying and hilarious. Overall, this movie is just funny. And they play around with the quirky nature of sizing in small objects like Legos and what a rat would do if it saw a small person. I mean, the end of the movie really plays with this stuff. The eventual team-up of Hank, Scott, and moderately unwilling Hope. The training montage and learning the different types of ants never feels terrible. I say that having killed 2 ants before watching this. Eerie, I know, or isn't that ironic? Even though initially Scott says the same thing we've all been thinking. Call the Avengers. This movie works with the smaller scale it has, but still has the MCU tie, so it does not just feel like its own separate movie off from everyone else. If you don't like bugs at all, maybe don't watch this movie, but I really think you can get through it. Thankfully, one of the reasons you should watch the movie, for the emotion, and one of those emotionally driven movie moments from the old time, it's not war footage at the grayscale and everything, but having a brief flashback moment to the air quotes death, spoiler alert for the Ant-Man sequel, of Hank's wife, doing their things in their suits. It looks great in itself, and it's a lovely tease to the eventual use and need to be in the quantum realm. A whole wild, smaller world. And the family parallels between the Pym and Lang family, the high emotional moments pair so well with the jokes thrown a mile a minute in this franchise. Also, like the Thor movie before it, Christoph Beck really captures not the high fantasy epics that we need from that Thor franchise, but the heist music for this soundtrack, the composing of it was so good and it just matches it so well. While I talk about how I wanted more Falcon in Age of Ultron, maybe the reason that didn't happen was because of him having not just a surprise cameo. He's not just a here I am, gone off to go fly and fight other things. But there's a one-on-one full fight scene against Anthony Mackie. And boy, is that an amazing Marvel romp that makes his movie a movie I already like so much better. When we eventually combine Scott and his burgling team with Team Ant-Man, it's a weird partnering, especially with the eventual romance blossoming between the eventual Wasp and our current Ant-Man. All these group moments are perfect, and there is something about good Dad Scott that will always make me smile. I gotta wonder if Dad Rudd will be a part of the Ghostbusters Afterlife character he's playing. I need that movie to be good, and seemingly he's not gonna be in it, but more Rick Moranis things, I wish he would even have a small cameo. I know his acting really hasn't been a thing, but if there's any way that can happen, man, that would be sensational for the third or fourth Ghostbusters. I'll let you loyal listener, you decide how many Ghostbusters you want to count, especially because there's a video game that allegedly was the third sequel already from the original two. So many a Ghostbusters products. I'll let you pick your own Ghostbusters cinematic universe. And the first heist scene I like because it's a little more small scale grounded, but the big heist scene, it takes time to get to. And it's a unique idea to make the final third a heist instead of a big battle. And don't get me wrong, the big battle exists, but the heist is clearly the visual exciting part. And something just to mention, the Anthony line, hilarious. While we're clearly trying to get away from the Shield Hydra things from the MCU for the end of Phase 2 and clearly into Phase 3 and beyond, having any tie to Hydra existing a little bit helps for the overall MCU tie. This is pretty much the swan song to those two groups existing. We pretty much go to Avengers support staff and eventually S.W.O.R.D. looks to be where we're going to go next, the next frontier. Not sure if anyone else ever noticed this when watching this movie. There's one Hydra muscle guy, and he always looks like European knockoff Aaron Paul. I know it's not Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad. I know it's not any of Aaron Paul's other characters, but I don't know if it's the hair or the beard. He always looks like some version of Aaron Paul. I always wonder, wow, did they really sneak him in this movie? There's no way they did, but always makes you wonder. If they're going to put him in the MCU, you think they got to find a way to put OG Walter White in this, right? Bryan Cranston and Aaron Paul would be lovely in the MCU. I don't know what yet, but I feel like that would be a good tandem to bring back again. Just like when they eventually need to put together Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman's MCU characters together for some fun Sherlock reference. I mean, look, they missed an opportunity to do something with Robert Downey Jr. and Benedict Cumberbatch, some Sherlock pun somewhere in there. Some of the best action scene moments are in the final third, before the big supervillain battle. Shrinking and growing and fighting, it looks the best here. And when we finally do have Ant-Man vs. the Yellow Jacket, the evil suit looks good enough. You just don't really care about Darren Cross as a character at all. At times he comes off like a whiny Iron Man villain. But while Marvel normally has villain problems, especially in the early MCU days, the fights normally look okay enough. This one, the amazing counterpoint to serious close-up action and fighting. And every so often it just cuts the music and zooms out wide to see the absurdity of what this looks like as a small-scale fight. Especially running over the villain with Thomas the Tank Engine. It's the nostalgia in me twisted a little bit. One of those toys I remember from my childhood. In those moments, the comedy and absurdity of this franchise is out to play. And while that is some of the best here, like, this is a weird movie. Hero, story, and somehow this makes it all work with some genuine heartfelt moments mixed in. This movie would be higher on my list. But that villain, it just isn't it. So Phase 2 is done. Time for another preemptive list until the grand scale Marvel Cinematic Universe ranking. But for now, let's hit Phase 2. Number 6, Thor Dark World. It still probably is the worst of the MCU. I mean, it has moments, but gosh, is you can tell something's wrong with Thor Dark World. I think it's the repetitive story beats. I think it's just villains that don't matter. That has to be it. Number 5, Iron Man 3 took some risks. Some were good, some were bad. It's great for a superhero festival time of the year movie. Not great for another bad villain. Hopefully Shang-Chi finds a way to tie up some loose final threads from Iron Man 3, but there's only one good Iron Man solo outing movie that is unparalleled good. It is the first one. 2 and 3 exist. They're okay, but Iron Man 3 is just okay. Number 4, gotta be a surprise that Avengers Age of Ultron's here. And I don't know if I ever would have ranked it this low to start, but you really notice those weird, dumb jokes that they throw in to Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron, and it is for sure a part of the framework of this movie. There's also a ton of characters that immediately get killed off. I'll always be annoyed about Quicksilver, I'll always be annoyed about Strucker, and the Helen Cho thing just adds to more of these characters that just are seemingly gone from the MCU. They could bring her character back, but the other two are dead and gone. But we do love Wanda. Vision is fine to start. Obviously, he grows more as the characters grow, but good intro to Wanda, and thankfully Hawkeye gets a little more TLC here. Number 3, back to the top 3 of our list. It was close between Ant-Man and Guardians of the Galaxy. I think Guardians of the Galaxy, based on that bigger scale of the movie, you have to give that the love. You have to. So we're going to go Ant-Man 3. I've given it away a little bit, but nothing wrong with Ant-Man. A lot of fun, highly watchable. Honestly, that and Guardians of the Galaxy fit really well with the same tone. And Guardians of the Galaxy just has a little more going for it. Both villains for those are kind of bad. I guess that's the one nice thing about Age of Ultron is, not that Ultron's the best villain in the world, but I enjoy that villain's personality a little more than Darren Cross or Ronan. Number 1, no doubt about it, this might be incredibly high on the eventual MCU overall list. Captain America the Winter Soldier is the perfect superhero sequel. It builds off things in the beginning, had to introduce a ton of new characters. They all work. The political intrigue works amazing with that superhero world. There's so much good about Captain America the Winter Soldier. It has to be number 1. Well, another episode in the proverbial book. Phase 2 may have had a slower start, but man did it pick up steam and introduce some new and exciting characters to the larger MCU. But what was your favorite movie, moment, or character from this chunk of Marvel magic? Was there something you hated? And how did my Phase 2 list compare to yours? Let me know on social at either knickknackmovies or knickknack_IC. Either Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Well, that's all for me, so cheers, and until next time, cinephiles. Are you not entertained? I think this is gonna be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. I don't like goodbyes. Let's just call this see you later, alligator.